and welcome as we come now to the 21st Sunday of the year. And the readings that are brought to our attention for consideration this week. The first is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 22, verses 19 through 23. Once again, a section from the letter of Paul to the Romans, this time chapter 11, verses 33 through 36. And the gospel reading this time comes from Matthew, chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. Well, as we have been considering throughout this year, the gospel tradition according to Matthew, I like to kind of have the whole of the gospel as part of our reflection. So maybe as we begin today again, I'd like to return to where we were last week. If you remember, last week we ended with a story of Jesus meeting, or she meeting Jesus, a Canaanite woman who had asked to have her daughter cured. Jesus had done that. This section, therefore, this would have been in chapter 15, has a couple more verses before we come to chapter 16. And that would have been a section in which this would be verses 32 to 39, so really it's a few. A second consideration, really, of the second story, of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. This had ended with, again, praise of Jesus, who had been praised for making the mute to speak, the maimed were made healthy, the lame were walking again, and the blind were seeing. And all of this was to glorify the God of Israel. So it was in that background. That then comes this second story, as I mentioned, of the multiplication, if you want, of loaves and fishes. In many ways, it reflects that of the first that we have looked at earlier on. And there are only a couple of slight differences. Now, we're not going to hear this, but slight differences in the second account from the first. Number one, that the number of people who are fed is 4,000 rather than 5,000. That the crowd who were with Jesus are pictured as having been with him 3 days, not simply one as the earlier one had. And that the disciples know in this account that there is food available. And when the kind of feeding of the large crowd is completed, 7 baskets of fragments are left over. In this case, Jesus seems to be feeding what we would call a Gentile group rather than an exclusively Hebrew. And of course, this is a fitting kind of conclusion to that episode with the Canaanite woman, where again, Jesus' attitude, you remember, had been changed, and he now is pictured as welcoming those who are non-Hebraic into the Christian belief or into the Christian community. What is noted also in this second account of the loaves and fishes is that the fish are dropped. We don't really hear much about them, and that leads those who interpret this particular passage to see Eucharistic aspects to it. Since, in fact, in our celebration of the Eucharist, we really don't use fish, I don't think. I don't think you've ever been to a Mass where fish has been part of the service, so it's bread and wine. And that, some say, is why in Matthew's Gospel already the importance of fish has been downgraded and to some degree eliminated. That then brings us to chapter 16, of which we will notice the first 12 verses are missing. Once again, it is a story of conflict with the authorities. This time, there is a grouping of Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, this is rather unique. Although Matthew does on 4 occasions in his gospel picture these two groups as kind of working together. You will remember that they were very different in their viewpoints on many things. The Sadducees, who were the priestly group and who ran the events that took place in the temple in Jerusalem, did not believe that there were any things that needed to be accepted except those which were found in the Pentateuch, in the so-called books of Moses, in the first 5 books. The Pharisees, on the other hand, although certainly dedicated and very important in their life to the Torah, was also their appreciation that there needed to be an interpretation of the Scripture, and they therefore developed what we would call an oral tradition or oral commentary concerning the tradition, and that led to, as we have seen on a number of occasions, different practices which the Pharisees, who were a popular group of lay persons, they were not priestly. You never find them ever engaged in any priestly activities. And also, interestingly, in the synoptic tradition, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you never find Jesus engaged in any priestly activities, which the whole understanding of Jesus as the priest is found, as we've mentioned earlier on, in a letter to the Hebrews, an important contribution to the New Testament tradition. So all of that finds these two groups, now not all of them, but they apparently have come down from Jerusalem, therefore that puts them in a particular relationship with the rest of the people, particularly the Galileans. There was a tension between the Galileans and those down in Judea, particularly in Jerusalem, and that was an understandable, well, it is understandable why in certain ways Jesus would be associated with the Galileans, and that would also put one of the reasons why there was this tension with him. They ask a sign from heaven from Jesus, identifying why he is doing the things that he is doing. Again, this is placed as a kind of test. What they're looking for, we're not sure. Are they looking for a bolt from heaven or a cataclysmic upheaval, something that they want very dramatic that would indicate that Jesus was doing the right thing? This Jesus refuses to do, and tells them that he has already worked signs if they had paid attention to them. And even signs, when they are done, often presuppose faith. They do not guarantee to create faith, but faith often lays, you remember, behind the activities that Jesus does, as particularly in the story that we looked at last time, where Jesus praises the Canaanite woman for her faith. That, in many ways, indicates why the healing took place. So the healing itself doesn't bring belief on the part of the woman, but the woman already has faith that in many ways God is working through Jesus. So at this point, still in this account, they are crossing the Sea of Galilee. And as they're going along, Jesus kind of talks to his disciples about bread, and they kind of misunderstand what he's indicating, and he warns them. Perhaps this again is a continuation of this little testing conflict that I mentioned a moment ago, to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Leaven, of course, is another word for yeast. And metaphorically, leaven is often seen as representing sin or corruption. And so what he's really saying to his disciples is that the teaching of his opponents is like leaven, and therefore they should be careful and be aware of that. Now, that brings us to the episode that we're looking this time. All of that is in verses 1 through 12 of chapter 16. Verse 13 really represents, from this point in Matthew's gospel, a turning point in his story. Chapter 16, verses 13 through chapter 20, verses 34, will describe the journey that Jesus is making with his disciples to Jerusalem. From this point on, much of the teaching now that Jesus is pictured as doing, and even the healings that he is engaged in, are centered with the disciples. No longer is the larger crowd often part at all of Jesus' activities or stories. So this would seem to be part of the gospel, this journey to Jerusalem, which of course had been first developed by Mark, but Matthew now really develops it in his own way, is an important section for those who would follow Jesus to also kind of be learning from. So this, as I mentioned, is really, when one comes to a kind of section of Matthew's gospel, is the turning point. Now, they come now to the territory of Caesarea Philippi. This, interestingly, is outside the territory of Israel. It is on the southern slope of Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is the single largest mountain, really, again, to the north of Israel. And it is here that at Caesarea Philippi, which is one of the major sources of the Jordan River. So as you may know, there are 4 different streams or bodies of water that ultimately form the Jordan, but this is one of them. A very beautiful site. It was known for its shrine. Was a very famous shrine in honor of the god Pan. And even today, when you go there, you will see there's a great cliff, and into the sides of the cliffs are a number of little, well, kind of cave-like entrances to which various different gods and goddesses of the Canaanites were placed and honored. But the most important was Pan, and you will remember he has a long history in the Greek tradition. The territory belonged to Philip, who was one of the sons of Herod the Great, and he had gotten this territory. And when he got it, the territory was known as Panin, P-A-N-I-O-N, but he does a kind of clever thing. He rebuilds certain cities there, or parts of the city there, and he puts a temple there, and he renames it Caesarea Philippi. Well, it's a twofold name: Caesar, honoring Rome; Philippi, his own name. And so that's how it was known. And you can see that there is a relationship, therefore, that he had established as a Hebrew leader with Rome. There is no Old Testament reference at all or significance to this particular place. So it does have a unique aspect of the Christian tradition. As they come there, Jesus asks his disciples an interesting question: who do people say that I am? Now, keep in mind, as we have noted on other occasions, that often persons were known already in different ways. One, of course, is to know the village or town or city from which that person came. And so therefore, obviously, we know, and tradition says that Jesus came from the town of Nazareth. You remember, although this is not in this gospel, but in the 4th gospel, one of the figures says, when he is being kind of invited to meet Jesus, says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" So there is a stereotypic image that a Nazarene not that they're up to no good, but that they're worthless or not of much value. That certainly would have been one way in which Jesus would have been known as the Nazarene, or he would have been known as the stone worker, or the woodworker, or the carpenter, and so therefore he would have been known as Joseph's son. And there is another reference in the scripture to that fact. So that's another way in which one certainly could identify who Jesus was. He was the son of Joseph. And third, you are known by your family. Now, there is reference to the fact that Mary was the mother of Jesus, that we knew, or that they knew in certain places, his brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, who are named, and then his sisters who are not named. So that would be another way in which one could identify a person, and one remembers when Jesus had come to Nazareth, they had questioned him, saying, where did he get all this wisdom? So in true Mediterranean fashion now, we have some knowledge of who Jesus is, but now he poses this question to his disciples. And they respond by saying, well, giving different perceptions of others. Some say you're John the Baptist, others say that you're Elijah, others that you are Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. Now, Jeremiah is one of the named prophets, again, that Matthew pictures Jesus as often making a reference to, because, and this of course would be understanding that the disciples were to gain, Jeremiah had suffered much for his beliefs. We have seen this earlier on in different episodes when we met Jeremiah. And so the idea here is that as Jeremiah suffered for his teachings and his beliefs, so Jesus also will, and kind of warning to his disciples, if you follow in my ways and believe me, that may also be the lot that will fall your way. So these are some of the ways, and interesting, see, Jesus is not often pictured as wanting to know what people think of him, but that's leading to a certain point where now Jesus raises this question with his disciples, but who do you say that I am? And it's at this point that Peter steps in and says, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And this little episode is important, certainly in the tradition. Jesus responds to him saying, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say to you, blessed are you, Peter, for you are the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. And to you I will give the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And what you shall bind on earth shall be bound on earth, and what you bind in heaven shall be bound in heaven, and what you shall loose on earth shall be bound in heaven and on earth. So this, of course, for many Catholics, by the way, watching this, would have been in an earlier time a well-known passage from the Gospels, Jesus' response to Peter. All right, now, his name is Simon. And that, of course, would have been the name his father and his mother would have known by and called him to dinner by. Paul, in one of his letters, refers to him as Cephas. So that would have been the Hebrew name for Jesus. And now he says, and changes his name, that's where I'm going here, and calls him Peter. Peter means, and does have a name, Rocky. It's sort of a nickname that Jesus gives to Peter, and that may well have been how he knew him. The name here tells nothing about the character, but a rock, when you think about it, now truly a rock is something which is solid, Those of you in an earlier time remember that one of the insurance companies used to advertise the Rock of Gibraltar, and therefore something that was so big and so firm that you could certainly trust in it. And that may well be what lies here, although the nickname Rocky can, I suppose, with an English interpretation, say something like a rocky boat or, well, anyway. Peter here, and this is certainly a significant gesture, is now given a very important role. In fact, three things might be noticed from this saying of Jesus: that Peter is the rock foundation for the church. Now, the term church is only used in Matthew's gospel twice, and in fact is not used in the synoptic Matthew or Mark and Luke. So what does church mean? Well, there are a number of ways to think of church, but perhaps it is better, most easily associated with the idea of the synagogue in the Hebrew tradition, which means a place of gathering. And so that is what church is. It is those who are gathered together. What gathers them together? Their belief in Jesus and their acceptance of him as the Lord and the Messiah. So it's a beautiful image. That church here, of course, is not seen as so much a building, but rather as a gathering together of believers. And so Peter is now chosen to be the kind of leader of this new community. To him is given the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Now, that, of course, is an interesting image, keys of the kingdom. Later on, we will have all kinds of pictures, right, of heaven with gates and Peter there kind of letting people in and all of that. But that perhaps is not what is understood here, but he is given an important role of leadership. And it is true that he who holds the keys has the ability to bind and loosen. So three things are given to Peter here. It is important to notice that this same gift, when the term church is used a second time, a little bit later on in this gospel, is also given to the community. But it is perhaps significant to see here that Jesus chooses Peter as a unique leader in the new movement that he is beginning to follow. Now, this raises some interesting questions here, because there has been, over the centuries, an interesting discussion with regard to exactly whether or not, when Jesus chooses Peter as the leader, and I think there's enough evidence in the New Testament and other places to suggest that Peter did exercise a leadership role, whether this role of being the leader of the community was exclusive to Peter, but was not something that was passed on. Therefore, it was an unrepeatable role that was given to Peter. Now, in the Christian tradition, there would be an understanding that that role was what we call the patrine privilege, patrine position, was something which was inherited and passed on from one person to another. At the time of the Reformation, and this is, of course, what in many ways split the Christian Church of the West, the role of Peter, or the role of the Pope, became a controversial issue. And then, of course, this was the 16th century, until the 20th century, was one of the major divisive situations between the Protestant or the Reformed groups and the Roman Catholic group. Today, biblical scholarship, looking again at this passage, and that's why we need to take a little opportunity here to reflect a bit on this, will certainly everyone will agree that Peter is uniquely chosen by the Lord for this mission. All right, so there is more of an ecumenical dialogue and more willingness to certainly honor Peter, and he does. He's not a perfect man, but he is a man who exercises leadership, and that, of course, I think is the essential role here that Peter is given by Jesus. You are to be the leader. You are to set the example. That's why you have the keys to the kingdom, because through you and with you and because of you, joining with me will help inaugurate and build the community. So again, a very famous passage. We get the opening part here. Later on, we will get the what happens next, which you probably already know, but certainly to reflect this time that it is the faith of Peter as well as the other disciples that will be important to for those who are his follower. The section from Isaiah 22, which is from first Isaiah. Remember last time we pointed out that there are three writers in Isaiah, but this is first Isaiah, mentions two names, Shebna, S-H-E-B-N-A, Shebna, and Eliakim, E-I-A-K-I-M. Now they were pictured, and there's a little bit of controversy here about them. They apparently were both connected with the household of Hezekiah, the king of Judah. This would have been between the years 716 to 687 before the common time. This is not an actual historical sequence, but rather is the way in which the interpretation of Isaiah makes it, okay? One is formally condemned and rejected, and then the latter is endorsed and commended. What we know about Shebna and Eliakim is that they were both what we would call masters of the palace. Now, or maybe we would call major domum, or some would call them scribes. But what it meant was that they held, and it's interesting, the term here is the peg, P-E-G. Now, keep in mind the tent peg, what holds the tent down. And apparently that was the signature that they carried with them, indicating their authority and what their tasks were. So you can see why this reading is connected with mention of the key in the gospel today. Now, by the way, this peg was carried in a heavy wooden box-like affair that the guy carried on his shoulder, okay? So it didn't hang around like you might see pictures thinking the peg there, but it was actually kept in a box that he had. But it indicated his authority with regard to the work in the court of the king. So in one case, he gets this job, then he loses this job to the next guy, then he doesn't do so well and he gets it back again. So it's a little bit of confusion, and as I mentioned, this is not history, but it rather is having to do with what we call a promissory oracle, namely saying that who carries the peg, who is entrusted with it, is the one who should be listened to and who should be, and hopefully did, demonstrate his loyalty to the king. So in that sense, when Peter is given the keys of the kingdom, it is his loyalty not only to Jesus, but also now his loyalty to the church, to the community, and therefore he is given a role of leadership. As I point out, for some in the Catholic community, that leadership will reside continually with the Bishop of Rome, and that's part of our tradition. But technically in the New Testament, I would say that we're not quite sure here, as we conclude, that Jesus is founding a church, but he certainly is giving leadership to the emerging community of believers in his way. Thank you for being with us, and we hope to see you again.